Good morning. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session on housing innovation in the face of a growing crisis. My name is Whitney Argoto-Bricky. I'm a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University, just across the river there. I'm really excited about the session this morning. There's a lot going on in terms of innovation at the state level, in terms of innovation in the private sector right now, and we're obviously facing a supply and affordability crisis that's affecting states across the country. Whether you're a red state, a blue state, a high-cost state, or a moderately priced state, this is really a challenge that everyone is facing right now. So I think we're going to have a really rich discussion, and I'm very excited to be joined by my fellow panelists today. Just to give you a sense of what's happening today, we're going to be introducing ourselves. We have about a 25-minute chat amongst the three of us, and then we'll open it up for a 10-minute Q&A at the end. If you have questions you'd like to ask, there are note cards on the table. If you can just write your question down and hold it up, someone will come and get it, and they'll bring them up at the end of the session, okay? All right, with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. As I said, I'm a researcher at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I mostly study rental housing, but also part of my job is tracking all the policy changes that are happening. And it is a really exciting time with a lot of momentum, a lot of people and organizations trying different things. I'm joined today by my two panel members, Kimberly and Ruby, and I'd like them to also introduce themselves. So first of all, Kimberly, you serve as the very new executive director at Ivory Innovations. Can you please tell us about your work at Ivory? What does Ivory Innovations do to improve housing supply and affordability? Who do you work with, and what is your very new role there?
I would love to. Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here. Ivory Innovations is a nonprofit. We're based at the University of Utah, and we have a mission to catalyze innovations in housing affordability. We're very dedicated to that mission. And one of the ways that we do that is with the Ivory Prize for Housing Affordability, where we work with students and entrepreneurs and industry leaders to find 25 top innovators with potentially very impactful solutions to the affordable housing crisis every year. And in the process of doing that vetting and that research and talking with each of those innovators, we've talked with over 1,200 different innovators. And we pick the top 25, and we award three of them, three winners, a $100,000 prize for housing affordability. And so we've learned a lot about innovation, and that approach that we're taking, I think, really highlights that there's no silver bullet to the housing affordability crisis. We need a lot of different solutions, and so our role really is to find and support and promote lots of different innovations across the spectrum. And my personal background, before I came to Ivory Innovations about 6 weeks ago, one of my roles was in working with state and local governments to create housing plans. And so in those engagements, I would work with stakeholders to take a comprehensive look across the housing ecosystem and every aspect of the barriers to housing affordability and find innovative solutions to those barriers. And in doing that, I really became convinced that innovation at the state level is really essential for creating the conditions that are needed to get to the affordable housing ability that we all want to see.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. And Ruby, you're the Turner Labs inaugural Chief Investment and Partnership Officer. Could you tell us a little bit about Turner Labs, as well as its sister organization, the Turner Center, and how you're working to improve housing supply and affordability? What does your role look like?
Yeah, so, I don't know if this thing is on. Hello, I'm switching it back and forth.
Do you want mine? We could trade.
Hello, okay, great. Thanks. So the Turner Labs works on unlocking housing affordability through innovation and entrepreneurship. It's a sister organization of the Turner Center, which is housed out of UC Berkeley, and it's a research think tank. And Turner Center is actually about to celebrate its 10-year anniversary, and Turner Labs has been around for 5 years. And really, they to me, there are two parts of this ecosystem where when we think about solving housing affordability to make it more sustainable, equitable, and affordable, we need to think both about public and private solutions. And so the center really focuses on kind of the research agenda. And what I really love about the center too is that it's very applied research, things that are timely and can help you today, like how do all these different sources of financing add cost to an affordable housing building? What can legislators do to reduce barriers and promote more affordable housing and also market rate housing? And then the lab side is really about turning that research into action. And we have a housing venture accelerator that helps incubate nonprofit and for-profit entrepreneurs to help scale their housing ideas. We also have a data lab, which frankly is kind of like a little tech hub, which is it's using a bunch of different data to help predict and understand what land use changes would be needed to support more housing production. And then we also have kind of a newer arm, which is part of what I'm focusing on, which is thinking more about how do we build an investment fund to actually support getting some of these organizations to scale and thinking, and I think especially folks in this room, I'm really excited to more talk about what is the role of government in funding innovation.
Thank you both for introducing your really wonderful organizations. They're certainly both organizations that we follow closely and are doing really amazing work. As we move into the discussion then, Kimberly, as Ivory Innovations works with a variety of different innovators, what promising or potentially impactful innovations or opportunities for increasing housing supply or affordability are really gaining momentum that you're seeing?
Thank you. Doing the switch. Yeah, it's very exciting. We're seeing especially promising innovations really taking hold in two key areas, I would say: new construction methods and approaches, and materials and policy and regulatory reform. On the construction side, new approaches to off-site or factory-built housing are really gaining traction. And this has been around for a long time, and it's run into a lot of trouble of issues that our innovators are finding ways to address. If done at scale, estimates are that offsite construction could reduce construction costs by 20%. One of the limiting factors has been that these factories are big, they're expensive, there's a lot of upfront investment involved, and there's a really consistent volume of production that's needed, and so they don't work well with housing booms and busts. One of our 2025 Ivory Prize winners that we're very proud of, Reframe Systems, which is here in Andover, Massachusetts, is a really cool example of an approach to that. They use robotics to build starter homes in local microfactories. The factory in Andover is only 17,000 square feet, and these small local factories are cheaper, they're less risky, and the fact that they are small and can be located near where the homes are needed means that the transportation costs are low. And it is clear that these ideas are gaining traction and they're catching on. We partner with the Housing Innovation Alliance and ProBuilder magazine on a survey of the nation's largest home builder. And our most recent survey showed that more than 20% of them currently use off-site construction methods of some kind. And those numbers are growing. Within 5 years, about 40% of them expect to be using off-site construction methods. On the policy side, states across the political spectrum are making really significant changes in their policy and regulatory frameworks to reduce the cost of building. Another one of our 2025 Ivory Prize winners is for the Live Local Act in Florida. And the act combines zoning reform with some resources and tax incentives to help make affordable and workforce housing more feasible. And of course, we're seeing that in places across the country as well. Texas recently passed interesting legislation with the same goal in mind. Oregon and California have both worked to limit some of the very restrictive local zoning that can make housing more expensive and difficult to build. So it's just really exciting to see that there's bipartisan recognition of the need for some innovation in housing policy and regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Ruby, your Turner Lab, I'm so sorry. Similarly, Turner Labs is working to scale housing innovations through various labs that you discussed earlier. Could you tell us what promising and potentially impactful solutions you're seeing coming out of these labs? And how does that intersect with the research that's also coming out of the Turner Center?
Yeah. So the Housing Venture Lab has been around since 2020. Each cohort is about 6 organizations. And you can see all of them on our website, but there's been some pretty amazing organizations that have come out of that. A couple that I'll just name is Pronto Housing. They're a software tool that actually supports affordable housing owners and operators. So it helps you make sure that you're in compliance. It helps you fill out renter paperwork. So it works with building managers and renters themselves. Anyone who's been close to that world knows how time, like burdensome, basically, compliance can be. And so this streamlines that whole process. Another one is Credvolve. They work with people who recently got denied a mortgage, which disproportionately happens to Black households. And they help, because also when you get denied, sometimes you don't know why, right? Or like, what do I need to do? Or, you don't know how close or how far you are sometimes. And folks who have worked with their product have increased their credit score by, on average, 53 points and are 10 times more likely to get a mortgage within a year. And so these are those bubble folks that are just sometimes hard to reach. And then another one is Ladder Up. They're based in the Midwest. They're based in Ohio. And they have a rent-to-own model, which I'm sure a lot of folks, including myself, were like, oh, God, rent-to-own. Like, there's, kind of a predatory history there. And there's definitely predatory models, but they are doing some of the best work specifically in low-cost markets where they're buying up homes that banks, are just less incentivized to lend on because they're such a low dollar value, and turning people into homeownership within 2 years. And so they're really mission-driven entrepreneurs. That's kind of the theme throughout a lot of our folks. And then the last one I'll just mention is Firm Foundation. They are a developer specifically working with faith communities to help unlock affordable housing, specifically permanent supportive housing on faith-owned land.
Thank you so much for those examples. It's really wonderful to see everything that's happening right now. The crisis is at such a level that we need things to happen, and we need things to happen relatively quickly. And these new forms are a way to build in both supply and affordability also relatively rapidly. So Kimberly mentioned it can bring down the cost of construction by 20%. Just by doing offsite construction. It can also reduce the time to build an apartment building by 40 to 50% by removing some of those barriers. This is a huge way of increasing the supply really rapidly. One of the examples we saw a few years ago was Factory OS put up a 110-unit apartment building in just 10 days. It's something we can do to increase supply really, really rapidly and build in affordability. The other recent example I've seen that was super interesting was the state of Hawaii working with the Modular Building Institute to quickly supply housing following the wildfires in Maui. And so these are solutions that we can also use to scale to different crises as we have increasing disasters, as we're facing affordability and supply challenges. And so it's very exciting to see all of the innovations that are coming out of both of your organizations and that you're lifting up. In your respective organizations, you're both working with public and private entities to solve complex housing supply and affordability challenges, which is increasingly important, right? There's not just one sector that can solve this. How do you delineate the roles and responsibilities of both the public and private sectors when it comes to modernizing the housing energy? And Ruby, why don't you start?
Yeah, so when I think about this, I think about the role of markets and the role of government, right, in the public interest. And to me, we need to ensure that markets work better to serve more people so that government resources can focus on the folks that will never be served by the housing market, because that's just a reality, right? And so how do we incentivize these markets to work better? I think there's a few things that we can focus on. One is, what are the ways that we can reduce cost, right? Like in my state of California, it's costing almost $1 million to build 1 unit of affordable housing. That is absolutely overblown because of the kind of burdensome regulatory environment that we have. So what are the ways that we can cut the red tape and roll out the red carpet for the things that should be prioritized, like affordable housing, right? It's easier to build a luxury condo than it is affordable housing. That's kind of, instinctually weird. And then the other piece too is, how do we use government capital to help scale innovation as well as spur innovation? So I think about the role government has played, over the past 10 years in the climate sector, like the launch of green banks and the idea of providing catalytic capital to support risk-taking in the market space that would not happen otherwise. And it can be a little controversial, or there's some debate on this, and I actually also used to work in philanthropy, and we would talk a lot about how do we use our dollars to incentivize private capital, because really that's what, and institutional capital, because that's what will get things to scale. And the way that I always like to think about it is how do we think about risk mitigation in terms of reducing downside versus juicing your upside? So if we can provide more guarantees of a return of capital, at least, right? Of saying, hey, government, we're gonna prioritize this and allow you to do this in flexible ways and kind of see what happens. We do the same thing in space, traditionally NASA and science. So as well as the NIH, like there's a lot of examples of government actually being extremely innovative in how they incentivize private capital to come in and get us to scale. And so I do think that there is that opportunity now. I also really just want to say, though, that this does not mean a retreat of state and local government and federal government, for that matter, in the housing market. Like, there is a major role for the state to be in the housing industry and not to retreat from that. And there's plenty of great examples of government doing it right. I think a lot of times when people think about housing and government, they think like Cabrini Green or Chicago or big public housing projects. But, you know, there's a lot of amazing things that we've been able to do. And so I just don't want to shy away from that either.
Kimberly, what do you see in your role as the optimal or even necessary role and responsibility for the public and private sectors?
Yeah, I mean, as you both have mentioned, in places that are really trying to make a difference here and have realized that we can't keep building the way we've always built and get different results, it's an all-hands-on-deck situation, and they're working with universities, nonprofits, quasi-agencies, other intermediaries, state legislatures to really make change. I do really see the public sector being largely responsible for setting the stage for creating the conditions that the private sector can respond to, but there's overlap there, and they have to work together, and those bridges need to be built and connected, and that's often what the nonprofits and the other intermediaries are doing. So in Utah, where Ivory Innovations is located, there's been a lot of population growth since the pandemic. The housing market has been slow to respond, and so housing is becoming much, much less affordable. And so in response, all of these actors are working together to try to make change. Either being led by Governor Cox, who is very invested in encouraging more starter homes, but it really takes everyone. The Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah provides the research and the data and really highlights what the problems are and where solutions are needed. And then based on that information, the state legislature and the governor work together to try to change policy to improve housing affordability. And the home builders have a role there as well. One of our sister organizations is Ivory Homes, which is Utah's largest home builder. And they participate in the Utah Housing Affordability Commission. They provide the builder's perspective there and just help bring the voice of what works on the ground. And working together, those organizations have made meaningful change in Utah in the last couple years. One of those has been introducing a statewide modular housing code, and that's now being used to build modular projects in Utah. Another one is the Utah Homes Investment Fund that provides low-interest loans to developers who build starter homes that are 1,400 square feet or less and cost under $400,000. That's where the market as it was really wasn't touching. Now with these new resources and a new regulatory framework, it's up to builders to take that on and to respond. And of course, there's more that can be done, but we are seeing them respond. More starter homes are being built, and that's helping families in Utah.
That sort of reflects what we've seen for middle income strategies as well. And I think a lot of states across the country are seeing that it's not just the lowest income households who are burdened by rent, burdened by home prices, but it's increasingly creeping up the income scale, and it's affecting middle income and even sometimes higher income households. And in response, a lot of states have created middle-income housing programs, and they really do use public policy and public resources to leverage innovative and nonprofit and private developers to fill that gap, sort of like you're saying with starter homes as well. A couple you've already mentioned the example of the Florida Live Local Act, but that's an example of that, where you're using property tax exemptions, zoning and permitting changes to then enable developers to produce housing that meets that middle income segment that doesn't have affordability right now. Even in Georgia, they have a rural workforce housing initiative, right? So a place where you might not think of housing really housing challenges creeping up the income scale, but they're using land and infrastructure development grants to local governments, as well as loans to developers to try to meet that need, especially in rural communities. And then finally, here in New England, we have Rhode Island recently created a middle income program with below market rate loans to developers, especially for those that are using innovative proposals for affordable housing construction. So this is really a way of getting the private market to spur this development, but to maintain affordability for a certain segment over a longer period of time, and is really interesting. It seems the other thing that states can do is to lift up these examples as we have them and to work together to see what's working in different places. There's certainly a really great state university system in a lot of places. Often they have planning departments. We can use this as sort of an extension service, as technical assistance, using students and faculty as points of contact for helping states to innovate and to create policies that are really meaningful, especially around issues like zoning and regulatory reforms. We are going to do a relatively lengthy Q&A, but we have a room full of state policymakers here and legislative staff that are really eager to think about some of these innovative policy solutions. So what opportunities do you see for state policymakers to really enable and support housing innovation in the housing industry? And Kimberly, do you want to go first on this one?
I would love to. In the states where I've worked, where I'm seeing really impactful solutions, they are often in regulatory reform to address the issues that make housing harder and more expensive to build. So one super interesting example is one of our 2025 Ivory Prize finalists, the Lower Sioux Indian Community Hempcrete program. They are a vertically integrated process. As the name suggests, hempcrete is made out of hemp. They grow the hemp, process it into a building material, and then build homes with it. And they've been able to test it on the reservation, but they really can't scale it without broader regulatory change. The reservation is tiny. It's 3 square miles. And so they worked with the Minnesota state legislature to change building codes in Minnesota to allow hempcrete. And now hempcrete can be used as a building material across the state of Minnesota. So I feel like that's a really good example of an innovation, an interesting idea that without some state policy innovation of its own, of policy change, that innovation is going to go into what we call the innovation valley of death, where good ideas go to die. So it's really the state policy that either unlocks the opportunity for innovation or blocks it. And this is a great example of the two working together. More broadly, I got to know Ivory Innovations when I was working on state plans for Rhode Island and Wyoming and other places. And states really want to learn from each other. They want to hear about the innovative ideas that are happening across the country, that have been tested, that have been replicated. They want to be able to point to examples of places where these approaches work. And that's where Ivory Innovations comes in. We, after all the due diligence that we do with innovators, we have a database of housing innovations that I found some interesting ideas to share with these different states for considering in their housing plans. And I'd love for you to check those out. You might find some good ideas that work for you. One, as I mentioned, is the Housing Innovation Database. It has all of the sort of top tier innovators that we've talked to over the last 7 years in the process of doing the Ivory Prize. And if you see something there that looks interesting, we have much more information than is in the database. We're happy to give it to you. We're happy to connect you with innovators. And then we also have an innovative policy database that has a lot of interesting examples of policy at all levels of government. And likewise, we'd love to be a resource for you and connect you with information and people who are putting those in place so that it's easier for you to adopt interesting ideas that work for your residents.
And Ruby, what opportunities do you see for state policymakers?
So I see three. Well, there's probably a lot, but three, I'll just keep it to three. The one is similar to what Kimberly was saying on reducing kind of or changing regulatory landscape. Specifically, what can be brought up to the state, right? Like centralizing decision-making at the state level can spur innovation as well. There's a lot of companies we work with who they can't scale to other states because they're like, gosh, we have to now do a whole other building code. We have to like figure out this regulatory environment, like whatever. Now, do that city by city, it's like whack-a-mole. We don't think about transportation as a hyperlocal issue, yet we think about housing as a hyperlocal issue. I'm sure that many people in this room live in one city, work in another, play in another, right? Like, we live regionally, and we should be thinking at least at the regional level when it comes to housing policy, even better at the state level. So there's things like permitting for modular or volumetric that some states are starting to bring up to the state level, and that is really helping streamline and create more predictability to allow developers to actually utilize this technology. Lot splits, ADUs, right? Like all of these things that we need to create a better floor that localities then can work on. But right now, without that, we're essentially being prohibitive and kind of tying one hand behind our back in terms of the solutions we have. I absolutely hate this narrative and the headlines that you're seeing around like the end of single family zoning and like, oh my gosh, we banned single family zoning. No, what you did actually is legalize more housing types. What we did is we banned multifamily housing. We banned ADUs, right? So it's a bit of a reframe. The second is utilizing the resources you have, building public inventories of public lands at the state level to then do matchmaking and coordinated projects that you could deliver affordable housing or whatever you need it for. Hawaii's done this with an Aloha project. It's Aloha Homes, I think. And they're starting now to actually, they've built this inventory and want to now kind of partner with developers to help utilize that. California has Surplus Lands Act, Colorado has done some of this too. But at the state level is where you really need that concentration of authority to build something like that. Because then you can also aggregate demand and economies of scale to get at better efficiencies for these projects. The third is digitization, just period. So this is, with our data lab, which is the tool that we're using to help inform cities on what land use changes they need to make to ensure that you can actually build housing. It includes economic feasibility in this and all of that. One of the biggest challenges in the cities that we're working in, we're working in about 25, is that every city has different data that they track and at different levels of sophistication. So this creates an extremely difficult project where maybe in one city you were able to create this model, this predictive model, in like a couple months. In another city, it's taking like a year. So if we could have better policies to digitize data at a state level, maybe even just like a small menu of options. There's groups like National Zoning Atlas, among others, that are starting to do a lot of this work, USDR. But this is about infrastructure. Like if we think about this the same way we think about highways, where especially in our increasingly digitized world and kind of the role that AI is playing and all that kind of stuff, your ability to curate, clean, and own your data is a form of currency. And so thinking about that as more of a power play, I think is a really big lever that state government has.
Well, as a researcher, I love to hear anything that says states should have good data and should make it accessible and all of that. That's music to my ears. But I also like your point that at the state level, you can think about raising the floor for everyone. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing right now. The momentum around has really been about, let's set state level standards, especially around zoning, for what can be built. And then that allows for a diversity of housing options. It allows for more different types of homes, different tenures in different areas. And it's also a way to bring down the cost of construction and remove some of that barrier to developers. And so you can say, we can change zoning and it may not actually get new construction in, but you're removing the barrier to at least make it happen. As you said, you're removing the ban on multifamily or on ADUs. A couple of things we've seen recently is, Oregon really sort of paved the way on this in about 2019, had a really massive zoning reform at the statewide level, allowing duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, even like small cottage clusters. And so that was a really big change at the state level. And since then, we've seen a lot more states follow that lead. Most recently, we saw a big reform in Washington around zoning, a huge package of reforms in Montana. It started in 2023, I think. They called the Montana Miracle. And that was really a package that addressed zoning as well as construction costs. So changing parking minimums, for example, which you may not think of as a housing issue, but parking is a housing issue, right? You need things to be able to pencil out. And we're seeing a similar package of reforms in New Hampshire as well, where they're allowing ADUs, allowing small multifamily in certain places. And so we have this really diverse group of states that are exploring similar options to, again, raise the floor for everyone so that developers can go in and say, okay, I can do small multifamily infill, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time just trying to convince the community that it's acceptable, right? And so I think there's a lot of really innovative, cool things that states are doing. And I think it's been pointed out already, but the fact that states can learn from each other and say, okay, what does raising the floor look like? What does it look like in my community specifically for my state? What are the challenges that I need to address? Can be really, really impactful as we go forward and are trying to address these overlapping crises. So I think that concludes our panel discussion, unless either of you have anything you want to add before I grill you with the Q&A. But the first question we have, which is a hard one, I think, but a good one, is what are 5 easy things that we could focus on now that can move the needle today, that can move folks to stable housing? So that's a lot of, what's the immediate step, right?
I don't know if I'm going to name all 5, but maybe together, collectively, we can. One is a rent cap. Like, I think literally if you want to keep people housed in the quickest way possible, it's a rent cap. And it doesn't need to be like a 2% thing. California passed a 10% rent cap. But some kind of floor like that is really, really helpful, as well as other kind of anti-eviction measures. I think another thing is, again, removing the ban. It doesn't add cost, right? It doesn't it takes some political maneuvering for sure, but if you just legalize more housing types, and then you're essentially market making. That's what we're seeing right now in a lot of California, Oregon, Washington. By some of these land use changes, there's all of these entrepreneurs and small businesses that are popping up right now. And so it's a really interesting time. I actually see a lot of opportunity in workforce development in the construction industry, because who's going to build these 2 to 10 unit buildings? It's not the trades, it's not the unions, right? They're too small. So there's actually an opportunity too when we think about kind of workforce development there.
So I have an economics background, and I'm a little bit less convinced that a rent cap will work. But I do think that there are a lot of approaches that can work. At Ivory Innovations, we're putting together a book, actually, of 6 different relatively easy things that local governments can do to help speed housing development. I mean, the number one thing that I hear from developers in the conversations that I have with them is that the process needs to be predictable. And something very simple is what we're calling a shot clock. There is a limit on the amount of time that a community can take to make a yes or no decision on a development. If a developer knows what that is, it's much easier to plan. Developers are successful. They can build housing that they need in a predictable way if they have what they call even flow pipeline. And that predictable process is so critically important for them. So another one, is along those lines, and I would say that it's just, use of digitization so that the plans are easier to review. And some limits on, many places have essentially veto power on the part of a very small number of nearby homeowners who can essentially veto new development. And so those homeowners are getting way outsized influence in what gets built, and the people who are not yet in the community don't have a voice. And so I think limiting, we've seen that in Texas, and I believe Montana did something similar to just reduce the power of a few people to stop development in its tracks. Yeah, I don't know if that was 5, but I'll stop there.
I might have 4 if I can remember them. I think number 1 is remove the barriers, as we've said. I think number 2, as Ruby said, is you need some baseline of tenant protections, but done thoughtfully in a way that's not going to discourage landlords and isn't going to discourage development. So I wouldn't say that's easy, but it's something that is sort of regulatory. I will definitely forget the last 2, but I'll say maybe 1 is to incentivize affordable, and you can do that through bonuses in sort of the regulatory zoning world. You can do that through tax abatements. There's a couple of different policy levers to specifically incentivize affordable. And then finally, along those lines, there's a segment of the market that will basically never be served because their incomes are just too low. And that's where a lot of challenges are going to continue to exist. And again, it's not easy, but standing up rental assistance programs and standing up something like a state LIHTC program is going to be absolutely crucial to make sure that everyone in your state is served and is stably and adequately housed. And so I guess those are my 4 that are probably neither things that are easy or can be done today, but are maybe on the easier end of the spectrum. The next question is, we say things like there's no silver bullet, and I'll just say that our director of our center always says there's silver scattershot. So there's no silver bullet, but do we maybe have too many disparate but overlapping programs? Can innovation include reducing complexity by consolidating funding or programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would agree, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the public funding sources that we have are complicated, they're expensive to use. It takes a lot of effort to put together the capital stack that's needed, especially for affordable housing, and it is raising the cost of housing. That should be the least expensive. So I think some simplification is definitely in order.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a couple ways to think about simplification. One is financing sources, and one is the regulatory agencies. So for example, California just passed this new thing, which is hopefully going to be game-changing, but we have 4 different state agencies that oversee housing, and they're combining basically all of them into like 2. And so then there's going to be more of a one-stop shop for resources. And it was really inspired a lot of ways by Minnesota. Minnesota has something exactly like this, where you can go in as a developer, give your address, the information about your building, and then they'll tell you kind of like concierge-like service around, here's all of the sources of financing you're eligible for. Just aligning that, plus then the dates. So think about it this way, right? When you're an affordable housing developer, I used to be a developer, and you go in for your tax credits or for your subsidies, both there's local and state, and you miss one of those sources, you have to wait another year to reapply for that source before you can get your project. This is what is adding a lot of time and cost to things as well. So the more we can streamline both the financing sources and the regulatory bodies that you have to go through, and then on top of that, if we could look at the laundry list of requirements that go along with that affordable housing project, like, oh, now you have to add a daycare, you have to make sure it's close to a grocery store, you have to do this, you have to do that, which are all really well-intentioned. But how do we create maybe a menu of options and say, pick 3? Think about how do we add more flexibility into the process as well as streamlining.
What are some examples of what states can do to reduce zoning barriers, specifically in rural communities?
It is, I think, really hard for local officials to change zoning where they live. I mean, many towns and cities, working in Rhode Island and Wyoming was very interesting. I mean, they both have, Wyoming has over 100 towns and cities, Rhode Island has 33. They're both the smallest states in the country. Most of Wyoming is rural, and it's tricky. They don't have the staff. They don't have the planning people. They just don't have the capacity to make those changes on their own. So, and, their neighbors might not want to see change. People are invested in their homes. And local officials don't want to get yelled at in the grocery store. So the state can provide some cover by putting some limits in place on zoning restrictions at the local level. In rural areas, infrastructure is always going to be a challenge, especially. So I feel like there's a whole another series of solutions that are needed there. Utah's working on an infrastructure bank that would provide, lower cost funding for developers to put in infrastructure, but that's going to continue to be a struggle.
Yeah, I feel like you know way more about this than I do. The one thing though that maybe I'll pass it even back to you, but the models, this is a little bit outside of zoning, but the sweat equity models really started in rural parts of this country. And so the idea of how do we utilize local workers or local folks to help contribute to building more of these housing, I think is something that we're seeing like in places like Fresno and other areas, but I don't know if if that's as popular now.
There's kind of an interesting example out of Vermont where they have done large-scale zoning changes, but also have done a real effort to put together a design toolkit in sort of a builder's workbook. And so one of the challenges in rural communities is that, a 50-unit multifamily development is not going to look right, yeah? And so Vermont, this is a place where the design is sort of a challenge, and they've put together this toolkit so that developers can go in and say, okay, this is what might look like in terms of infill in different types of communities and what might be appropriate for different contexts, and to work through that with builders so that they understand the process and it can be a smoother path. And so in rural communities, the consideration might be something like ADUs or opening up different types of housing options and then really showing people through case studies what that could look like. A related question that I hope you can answer is, beyond zoning regulations, are there building code innovations, and single stairs is mentioned as one of the examples here, which absolutely, or others that states are using to drive down costs to build new housing?
Yeah, I think building codes is clearly sort of the next frontier in terms of it's even more difficult in some ways than zoning because in some ways building codes at every jurisdiction are different, not just at the jurisdiction level, but at the inspector level. And so there's often, it's sort of the flavor of the day, and that's very hard for builders to deal with, especially that are trying to build over a large geographic area. And so I'd say some standardization in building codes would be huge. I mean, the single stair is an important one for retrofitting office buildings to housing space, but there's a lot of innovation, and I think that's really where the next innovation needs to come.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting one too, because I'm sure as many of you guys, sometimes when you hear building codes, your eyes just kind of glaze over and you're like, oh boy, because it's really also dense, you're like talking about things like single staircase or like lead pipes or, whatever it might be. But it is really important. And I think, again, this is something that the more that we can centralize and bring up in terms of which is this, sometimes that, I ask like, is this something better regulated at the local level, at the state level, at the federal, right? Like fixing your potholes and your sidewalks is a local job, right? Doing things like building code changes, I think should be a state job. The other thing I would just say too, though, is a lot of what the fights come down to is around health and safety, right? And so thinking thoughtfully about engaging with your fire marshals and engaging with that sector in particular to also, it's a little bit of you don't do it like in a patronizing way, but like it's a little bit of education too around there's other places around the world that don't have as many fire sprinklers and yet they're fire resistant and have other technologies to make sure that we are as safe as we can be and still kind of moving with the trade-offs that we have. Like every day, right, you get into a car, you take your life in hand. So I think we also have to balance the level of risk with kind of other priorities as well. But I think that's a conversation that needs to happen specifically with fire marshals.
I'm going to ask, do we have time for one more really good question? One more? Okay. I think this is a really important issue, which is why I'd like to ask it. And it's about workforce challenges, right? So we have a labor supply issue in construction. Are you seeing workforce challenges, especially for doing things like plumbing, wiring, that kind of work at the end site? And is there something that can be done at the state level to address this labor supply challenge that intersects with these issues? Yeah.
There's definitely a workforce challenge. Construction labor force participation rate has not achieved the pre-pandemic levels or even pre-housing crash levels. So folks are not getting into especially skilled and trained professions, right? There's more in the unskilled labor category, but it's definitely something I think the state can do. I think it's an opportunity, frankly, in terms of how do we support good paying jobs and alternative paths for people. There's a lot of examples of states doing these kind of programs. I think that it also needs to be a conversation with unions and with trades too around what is their role, what is kind of small scale builder roles. So like there's kind of different lanes too when we think about, for example, ADU construction, right? That's not something unions are going to touch, nor do they need to. But is there something the state can do around like creating programming or funding to support people to learn more about that? We're seeing a ton of folks get into specifically the ADU and kind of duplex, fourplex space and trying to figure it out as they go. And so there could be a really great opportunity to partner with like community colleges, for example, and think about workforce trainings to support small business. It's a small business play too.
I'll just add that modular does help with that issue, especially in rural areas where there's typically especially a shortage of the trades. The jobs in modular factories tend to be safer and more easily accessible to a broader range of the population. So that's a way to bring more people in to the construction industry that works for them.
All right, we are out of time. I want to thank you all for joining us. Just for logistics, the next housing session is going to be on soaring rents at 1:15 in room 205. And I think there's some additional information up on the slide there. We really appreciate you all joining us for these 45 minutes, and thank you so much.